All right. I'm here with Richard Norman. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
Uh, I wanted to talk to you about humanism in particular, and the consequences of that in today's world. And I wanted to sort of calibrate this discussion by asking first off, do you ever feel like these days where people say that we're living in a post-truth environment, a lot of people are kind of sick of being human or sort of look at humans with disgust? Um, do you feel like humanism, as a humanist, you're sort of like sitting in the bunker these days?
Well, there's a lot of different questions there, aren't there? Um, I mean, there's, I suppose, a certain degree of pessimism about human capacities. And I suppose the sense in which that links up with the idea of living in a post-truth environment is that people have a sense that, at least in certain circles and in certain parts of society, there's an increasing contempt for the whole idea of truth.
Yes.
And I suppose that links up with what you were saying about um, people losing faith in humanity, if you like.
Right.
But I guess the conclusion I draw from that is that it emphasizes all the more strongly the need for humanism and the importance of a humanist perspective to stand up for the sorts of things that human beings are capable of when they use their capacities to the full. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, fair enough. So for people who are walking into this totally blind, why is this called humanism? I mean, that seems like a lofty title for a philosophy.
Well, there's no simple definition of humanism, but the way I would like to define it is in terms of relying for our values and for our decisions about how we want to live on what it is to be human, on our distinctively human capacities, and not looking for some non-human, supernatural or superhuman source of inspiration and source of values.
Fair enough. And when we're talking about superhuman or supernatural, I assume you're referring to things like belief in a creator God or something.
Yes, yes, that's right. I um, don't like to define humanism in too negative a way. I mean, historically, I think too many humanists have tended to identify humanism simply with a rejection of religion, but I think it's important to go beyond that, to try to do justice to what it is about human beings that provides a basis for how we're to live, rather than just saying, well, we don't believe in a deity and we don't think that one can therefore rely on any kind of divine providence or revealed truth to tell us what to believe and how to live.
And on that same note,
Mhm.
one of my first exposures to humanism, along with your work, was the during college, the when we could gather together, um,
Mhm. Yes,
was these sort of secular humanist. It was called like Secular Student Society, and it was
correct.
in some
Yes.
ways trying. I don't want to say replacing religion, but at least replacing the
Mm.
community aspect of it.
Yes.
People gathering. Are you in touch with that world at all?
Yes, yes, certainly. I am a member of our local humanist group. um, as you know, I live in the UK in Canterbury, in the county of Kent, and we have a group called Kent Humanists, and we meet once a month to talk about humanism and to talk about larger issues and to talk about a humanist perspective on them. And yes, it does. It meets an important need. Again, I think it's important not to ape the rituals and practices of religion, as I suppose, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, some people in the humanist movement, the ethical movement, as it was often called then, tended to try to sort of replicate quite closely
Right.
what the Christian churches had to offer. I think most humanists wouldn't see humanism in that way now, but it is important, yes, for humanists to feel that they are part of a community of like-minded people, I think. Of course, the need for community is met in all sorts of ways, and although religious communities have traditionally played an important part in that respect, not everybody who's non-religious will feel the need to meet up with fellow humanists, even if that's how they describe themselves. But nevertheless, I think it serves an important function, definitely. And I'm interested to hear that you discovered humanism partly in that way. Mm.
Yes, and when you said we're not trying to replace the rituals of religion and so
Mm.
on, I
Mm.
read this or not biography, but book 12 Who Ruled, about the French Revolution, and they
Oh,
talk about
yes,
how
right.
they started replacing churches with like prayers to human values, and it was clearly trying to ape that.
Yes, that's right. Well, the Panthéon in Paris was built as a kind of secular temple, wasn't it? With, I mean, the most extreme version of that was a bit later than the French Revolution, but the famous French philosopher Auguste Comte created a whole set of elaborate rituals, um, trying to replicate everything about Christianity in a way. To a most ludicrous degree. That the famous humanist philosopher John Stuart Mills said of him, he was clearly a man who was incapable of laughter.
Yeah.
Because of the ludicrousness of what he devised. So that's the sort of thing I have in mind, yes. And you're right that the French Revolution renamed all the months and created its secular saints and so on. I
Yeah.
think we've grown beyond that, I would say.
And on in this similar vein, when we're talking about, I do you feel like there's a human need that everyone has that religion fills for a lot of people, and that even if it's not a sort of one-to-one imitation, that
Mm,
humanism ought to, if it's going to be successful or
mm,
meaningful for people's
mm.
lives, ought to also fulfill?
Yes, I do actually. Yes, I mean it's foolish to, if you reject religious belief, it's foolish to see it as some kind of giant aberration. Clearly, every human society has had religious beliefs and religious practices, and that's no accident. And clearly, religion has always met very, very deep human needs. And I think it's incumbent on humanists to think seriously about that, to think about what those needs are, and not just to be blasé about it and say, oh, we've left all that behind, so we don't need to worry about it. So yes, absolutely. And I suppose, I mean, you've talked about the need for community, and I think particularly it's a community of shared values.
Right.
It's not so much beliefs. I mean, a lot of humanists tend to treat religions as a set of doctrines and beliefs, and to suppose that that their task is to somehow debunk those beliefs, and that's it. But as you imply, I think religion goes much deeper than that. For I would say the majority of people, religion is not primarily about a set of beliefs. I mean, the three terms that are often used to characterize the role of religion are uh, believing, belonging, and behaving. And the belonging and the behaving are at least as important, if not more important, than the believing for most religious people, I think. So yes, those aspects it's very important to take seriously, I think.
And in terms of the differences, I suppose, I imagine this is true in the UK. I know it's true for where I'm coming from, but that Christianity tends to be the most dominant
Yes,
religion.
yes.
And
Mm,
while I don't think Christ was like this, I think that Christianity as a religion, even with just the image of Jesus on the cross,
mm.
literally glorifies suffering. Um,
Oh, that's interesting.
but
Mm.
what about humanism? Does it treat it the same way?
Certainly doesn't glorify
Yeah.
suffering. I think one needs to be careful about well, about any generalizations about religion or specific religions, really. I mean, there's a strand in Christianity that does seem to glorify suffering, certain kinds of depictions of the crucifixion and so on. But at the same time, I know a lot of Christians who are very positive in their outlook, who are inspired by the resurrection in a way that a lot of them interpret in symbolic or metaphorical terms as a belief in new life and a belief in the way in which that sense of new life can inspire people to make the world a better place. So, I mean, over the years, I've come to think that within any of the major world religions, you can find as great a diversity of attitudes and positions as you can in humanity at large. So describing it as glorifying suffering is, yes, as I say, it's true of certain strands in Christianity, but I wouldn't want to pigeonhole it in that sort of way, I don't think.
Absolutely. And I'm for the record, I'm not anti-religious or
Yeah.
anti-Christian or anything along those lines. I love reading the Bible.
Oh, yes, that's interesting. Yes, so do I. Yes.
Yeah. What do you like about it? A lot of people
I have
read it.
to confess, in part, I'm one of those people who loves the language of the King James Bible. I don't know whether you use that, but there's something about early 17th century English. It's the language of Thomas Hobbes and the late Shakespeare and so on. There's something terribly rich about it. Yes, again, I mean, the Bible is an incredibly diverse set of different forms of literature, and it's a strange mixture. It's a strange mixture. I love, actually, one of the books of the Bible that I'm particularly fond of is the first book of Genesis. And if you read Genesis like a kind of epic poem analogous to Homer's Iliad, say, you don't go for any of this nonsense of it being a literal description of creation or whatever, but just this wonderful sequence of stories and narratives which exhibit so many different dimensions of human life. I mean, if you just start with the story of the fall and the way in which it points to that complex relationship between human consciousness, human self-consciousness, sexuality, work, gender relations. I mean, it's an incredibly rich story, and one can find a lot of insight in it once you learn, as some Christians do, to read it in the right sort of way as a story.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And do you think that's part of the reason why it's still, I mean, it's interesting that all of the great religions, maybe like without Buddhism, I mean, there's some there, but are founded on great literature as well, like the
Yes,
Quran,
yes,
the
yes,
Bible, etc. Well,
yes.
why do you think that says something maybe about humanism and the direction that it can go? I mean, I'm not. Are there any great works of humanist literature? Would it? If
Well,
this
that's an
Bible,
interesting question. I wouldn't say they're not exactly great works of humanist literature, but I would say that it's important for humanists to, as it were, reclaim the great traditions of world literature as sources of humanist ideas. I mean, some of them written by great humanists. I've been thinking particularly recently about the humanist novel, if you like, and some of the classics of the English novel. I'm going to be rather parochial about the English novel and think of it as the novel written in England and not just in English now.
Fair enough.
Though we can find US examples as well. But great novelists like George Eliot, writer of Middlemarch, Thomas Hardy, Virginia Woolf. These were people who were quite clearly humanists. They didn't necessarily use the word humanism, but they were pioneers of a humanist way of thinking, quite undoubtedly, looking for, very explicitly seeing religious belief as a projection of human needs and human values, and writing their novels in that vein. I guess, if we wanted an American example, I guess I see Steinbeck as a great humanist, an explicitly humanist writer. The Grapes of Wrath, I think, is a great humanist novel. And in calling them humanist novels, I'm not saying they're exclusively humanist. They are a treasure for all human beings, and I think that's characteristic of humanism. That what humanists value are the things that we share as human beings, rather than something exclusive and specific to humanists.
So, what are, on that note, then, there's
Mm,
a famous line in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov where
yes,
one of the characters says, like, if there is no God, then all is
yes,
permitted. Why should
yes.
we be moral at all?
Um, because uh, as human beings, we live in human communities. Our lives are shaped by our relationships to other human beings. Our identity is created by our relationships to other human beings. And it's no accident that it's a deep feature of human beings that they have this capacity for empathy with other people's experiences. Now, of course, all too often, human beings fail to act on that, fail to act on their recognition of other people's needs or other people's suffering or whatever. But it's nevertheless, we are social beings. This is a way of thinking about how we ought to live, a way of thinking about ethics, which goes right back, as so much in humanism, goes back in the Western tradition to Aristotle and the Greek thinkers. Aristotle famously said, human beings are social animals. It's sometimes translated as political animals, but what Aristotle means by that is social. We live in communities. And you find the same idea in other world traditions as well. In Confucianism, for example, is very strong, that recognition of the social nature of human existence.
And what
Mm,
about when you remove the element of some higher authority looking over your
mhm,
shoulder, and we're
mhm,
talking about morality being centered on the fact that we're living in communities and so on?
mhm.
What about um, crimes or wrongdoings uh, whose bad effect is only seen if they're like discovered? In other words, like someone cheating on their wife.
Yes. Mhm, mhm.
Couldn't you make an argument that, hey, as long as you don't, as long as you're like, the ethical thing to do would be, okay, go ahead and cheat on your
Mhm,
wife because it makes you happy,
mhm.
but
Yes.
and it makes the person you're cheating on with happy as well, let's say.
Yeah. Mhm.
And as long as you're hiding it successfully, like the
Yes.
ethical thing to do is to become a good
Mhm.
liar. Why is that wrong?
Well, as people, of course, would classically say, and you don't need humanism to tell you this, because of what it's doing to your relationship with the person that you're betraying,
Right.
why that relationship matters to you, and what you lose if you lose what's valuable in that relationship and how it helps to shape your life. And I think that way of talking about it would go for huge dimensions of human life. And that's what I mean by talking about human beings as social beings. That our relationships with other people are not just external to us; they're not just a matter of finding it convenient to benefit other people in the hope that they will benefit us, that sort of tit for tat idea.
Right.
Our relationship to other people is what gives a sense and a meaning and a purpose to our lives. It's not just something external to us. I mean, it's interesting that um, when people allude to the Dostoevsky quote, um, and when they imply without the constraints of religion, people would just act purely selfishly. What what they forget is that quite often when people act badly, it's not because they're being selfish. It's because of the importance of their relationships to them. People will do, someone who is being unfaithful to his wife and takes a lover will do terrible things for the sake of their lover. Someone who notoriously, people will commit terrible crimes in the name of their communities, their nationality, their religion, but not just their religion. So I mean, I would say, the biggest threat to um, uh, human right action is not the danger of selfishness, though of course that's a problem, but the danger of misplaced loyalties.
That's
Sorry, I'm
interesting.
starting to preach now.
No, no, no. Go ahead. I'm open to
Mm.
whatever. That's an interesting concept. I was uh
Mm.
I was just reading The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb, and he's talking about the formation of nation states and how easy it
Right.
was to just draw a
Mm.
line, give people a flag and a
Yes.
national anthem, and then suddenly very fiercely defensive of of just this arbitrary quality. Does
Yes.
the fact that we are, even those of us who are conscious of this,
Mm.
we are still uh, very like we're creatures on this planet, and
Mm.
our we're trying to reason
Mm.
our way to some kind of ethics. But don't you think that that's an approach that is going to fail when we take into account the fact that we are like barely more than apes?
Well, I mean, yeah, there is an issue there, and you're right. I mean, it's a problem for what I've been saying so far, because I've been talking about, human beings as communal beings, and that's what shapes our values. But as I've also said, the problem is that people identify themselves with partial exclusive communities, and the strength of that community too often resides in who it excludes as much as who it includes.
Right.
So yes, the problem of um, identity by exclusion is 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 a big problem for human ethics. That's right. So I suppose, if you like, it's, as you were suggesting, a feature of our evolutionary ancestry that we derive from um, our ape black ancestors lived in groups, and identification with a group was an important part of their being, their biological being. So in talking about a humanist ethic, I suppose, well, quite certainly, what we need to emphasize also is the growing recognition of our common humanity, which I think you can look at historically and take encouragement from, the extent to which, as human societies become more and more interlinked. I mean, I suppose, if you like, this is the positive side of globalization, that people are in contact with human beings from a whole diversity of societies now. And so recognition of the humanity of the other, in one sense, comes more naturally, or is much more accessible to us now. If you look at the history of war and colonialism and imperialism and so on, and the demonization of the other as less than human, that becomes more and more difficult to do when our lives bring us into contact and relationship with other human beings from different cultures so much more. I talked about Aristotle just now, and I think he's a very instructive example, because on the one hand, he's got this very strong recognition of values and ethics being rooted in our nature as human beings and what we need in order to function effectively as human beings. But of course, also notoriously, Aristotle said dreadful things about the superiority of Greeks to non-Greeks.
Right.
He argued for the idea that barbarians are by nature slaves because they possess reason to a lesser degree than Greeks do. And he said some terrible things about women in the same vein. And it's always struck me how this great intellect with this great insight, not only into human ethics, but one of the greatest philosophical thinkers there ever was at the same time trapped in the mindset of his own society and his own culture. And that contradiction within his thought, I think, is very instructive something we all need to be aware of.
Yeah, I guess on that note, do you think then that nation states are an obstacle to humanism?
It certainly can be, yes,
Okay,
yes, and yeah, yes, yeah. Do you,
sure.
what do you have in mind? What do you,
I
what?
suppose what I'm asking is
Mm,
when we are, because these borders,
mm,
whether or not your opinion on how we
yes,
manage them, they are
mm,
arbitrary. Like we have to
yes,
admit that. I mean,
yes,
in Los Angeles, that's it is in Spanish. It's originally part of what is now Mexico,
yes,
and
yes, mm,
but people get very fiercely defensive of it, and it becomes an obstacle to recognizing each other's humanity. And
right.
it seems like this fierce nationalism is one of the uh, trend lines in our society today that
Yes, well, yes, I mean, you've seen the, if I may say so, the nasty side of that in the States
yes,
all too recently.
yeah,
Um, yes. And we don't need to don't need to invoke the quote. Mm,
of course,
wow.
yeah. So
Mm. And I think also, yes, I mean, I think we're increasingly it's the case that the big problems that face us today are the problems that face us as a human community. Most obviously, problems about climate change and the destruction of the natural environment, which we have no hope of tackling effectively unless we all transcend national boundaries, national borders, um, and work on them at a global level, tackle them globally, internationally.
and let me ask you this: do you think there are any there's anything out there that someone could do that besides things like fasting during Ramadan or
Mm,
uh, you know uh, going to confession, things like that, besides like the rituals of a given religion,
mm,
is there
mm.
anything that without a god um, it becomes moral that would be immoral if there was a god? Does that uh, do you see what I'm asking?
Well, I think so. Yes, I mean there are there are a lot of controversial moral issues about which people disagree, where to some extent the fault lines coincide with the division between humanists and the religious. But again, as I said earlier, it's very important not to stereotype religious positions. I mean, famously, um, um, the acceptance of gay sexuality um, has been hugely obstructed by some of the world religions, some strands in some of the world religions. Just to take the case of Christianity, um, for a long time, you had to be a very brave Christian to say gay people are to be accepted as just and the love of gay people is just as valuable and just as acceptable and morally acceptable as human love in general. That within the Christian, within, well, again, it's dangerous to generalize about the Christian churches. Within some of the Christian churches, that battle has been won or is being won. In others, it hasn't. So it's not exactly an example of what you're asking, is it? It's not, one can't quite straightforwardly say, well, that's morally acceptable if you're a humanist, but it's morally unacceptable if you're religious. It's not as simple as that, but that's an important part of the story. Another example, one of the things that um, humanist organizations, humanist groups campaign for strongly, and where we haven't yet won the battle in the UK, is the legalization of assisted dying. When people are terminally ill, suffering terribly, compassion says if they're just asking, desperately asking you help them to end it all, they just don't want to go on suffering. Um, the I mean, for almost all humanists, I think the right thing to do would be help them end their suffering, take pity on them.
Right.
Now, I know in some states in the US, that's now legal, permissible, isn't it? And others not. I don't know how it is in California. I know Oregon was one of the pioneer states, wasn't it, on this?
Oregon, yeah, I don't think
Mm,
it's crossed over in California yet.
no, no. But that, again, that's another example. And again, it doesn't coincide simply and straightforwardly with the fault line between humanists and the religious. But it's still the case, actually, that a lot of spokespeople for the established church in this country resolutely set their face against the legalization of assisted dying, and certainly the Roman Catholic Church does.
Yeah.
Some of the other Christian denominations are more open-minded about it, and recognize that it's a matter for human choice. Of course, nobody is going to say you have to ask for assisted dying, but if that's how people choose to try to cope with end of life suffering, it's their life and it's their choice, and that's what humanists would say. But there's a certain strand in Christianity which says no, life is the gift of God, and therefore, however desperately someone wants their life to end because all they've got to look forward to is agonizing suffering, they don't have a right to say so.
Yeah, it's there are two things that I was thinking of as you were saying that. The one is I'm sure you're familiar with the Seneca quote, which is talking about the end of life, and he's
Yes.
like, "Don't you don't have to drink every last drop of wine in your glass.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
don't be greedy." Like,
Yes. The Stoics were very enlightened about this. That's absolutely right. Yes.
yeah,
Mm.
and also, like in my experience, I went to a Catholic high school, and we had a classmate of ours commit suicide the summer before our senior year. And
Yes.
that message of, this is not just a sin, but this person's
Mm.
going to hell. And it's like, this is a
Yes.
17-year-old
That's,
boy.
yeah.
He's a
You're right.
child. And
Mm.
they handled it
Mm.
really poorly. But
Mm.
um, yeah, I think people have those kinds of experiences with organized religion that turns them off
Yes.
in a major way.
Yes. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I mean, yes, just to use the language of sin in that context. I mean, of course, you know, suicide in general typically is a terrible tragedy,
Yeah.
but the language of sin is not the appropriate language.
Yes. I mean, I think it's fair to say maybe like it's a mistake, um, in at least in those kind of cases. But
Mm, mm.
did were you always this way? Were you always a born humanist? Did you have?
No, 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 no. I mean, very much not. Um, I, I, I grew up. Well, I grew up as a Christian, really, for the first 20 years of my life.
Yeah.
Um, my, I mean, it's interesting, the attitude of my parents, and I increasingly became aware of this, I guess. I think my parents became increasingly doubtful of um, any religious faith, but they, certainly my mother, thought it would be a wonderful thing if one could have a religious faith.
Yeah.
So I went to Sunday school, I went to church, and yes, I was very religiously, so to speak, went to church and took it very, very seriously. But I mean, I took it seriously to the extent that I gave a lot of thought to it. It was a very important part of my life. It wasn't just a superficial part of my life. So I became also very engrossed in trying to think it through, and increasingly came to recognize that when I tried to think it through, actually, I couldn't defend it rationally.
Mm.
It was a bit of a wrench. I mean, I suppose the decisive thing that made me recognize that really I was a humanist was, as so often happens, going to college, meeting new people, forming new relationships joining new communities, and coming to recognize that though the religious community, which had been a very important part of my life until then, although it had been a very important part of my life till then, if I were to try to explain that to people from a very different cultural context, there's no way in which I could justify it and make it rationally convincing to them. So if you like, once from within that membership of a religious community and that religious perspective, the question always for me was, how can I justify it? Once I meet new people and look at it from their perspective and think, what would they make of it? I came to realize, actually, it's only, from within it may make no sense, but from the outside, you can't really make a rational case for it.
Interesting. That's do you feel in making this transition, when we were talking about post-truth in the beginning of this,
Yes.
do you feel like it is harder to defend the idea of truth with a capital T, or at least our ability to grasp it, when you no longer have this sort of like solid notion of a creator God, and now we're just a bunch of human beings making these interpretations?
Well, it's interesting that you said truth with a capital T. Yes, as a humanist, what I'm wedded to is not the truth, but the search for beliefs and ideas for which we can give reasons. Rationality is at the heart of it, but again, it's not rationality is something abstract with a capital R. What it means for me as a humanist is that one should be able to give reasons for one's beliefs, reasons for one's ideas and one's attitudes. And I think that links up with what we were saying earlier about community. Adequate beliefs are those that you can justify to other people on shared grounds. Yeah. So it's never enough just to say, well, these are the beliefs of my community and that's good enough for me.
Right.
The challenge is always, I think, how could one defend those beliefs to other people who don't necessarily come from the same starting point as you?
A lot of people, or a lot of philosophers, though, who I don't know if they would describe themselves as humanists, but they would certainly be atheistic. I'm thinking of people like Foucault and other postmodernist thinkers.
Yes, yes.
Try to sort of, and I forget the guy's name, but he was one of these French postmodernists who regretted what they had done to the concept of truth, and said that we've made it out to be just a series of endless interpretations, and that can lead to things like climate change denialism, of like, hey, what do your models mean after all?
Yes.
Do you see that as a philosophical problem?
Yes, I do. I mean, I have to say that my own philosophical work has not been within that tradition. I've read little bits of postmodernism, but I see it as I mean, I guess its day has passed. It's no longer as trendy as it used to be, but I see it as and saw it as a very worrying tendency, precisely because it seems to jettison the idea of truth and ends up with a kind of relativism that truth is internal to particular discourses. And I mean, in the end, it just flies in the face of our human experience, of the fact that we communicate with one another. I think that strand, it always seems to me that philosophical strand is a kind of relativism. And the decisive refutation of it is precisely the paradox of relativism, that people who argue for postmodernism or relativism or whatever it is, argue for it as true.
Right.
They don't argue for it as just my discourse.
Yeah.
They say, no, this is right. Yeah. And I mean, that's not just an ad hominem point. whenever one tries to articulate any intellectual position, you're trying to articulate it in ways that make it plausible from an impartial standpoint, not just plausible to those who share one's own discourse.
And you say it's had its day, and maybe it has in the academy, but it feels
Yes.
like outside, particularly within a lot of activist circles who I'm
Mm,
either affiliated with or am sympathetic to,
mm,
use these kinds of concepts of,
yes.
say, like, how can you, like, my lived experience,
Hmm.
these sort of phrases where I can kind
Right.
of get where they're coming from, but it also sounds to me like, here are
Yes.
my anecdotes. Believe this instead of data. Um, do you-
Yes.
does that trouble you
Yes,
at
that's
all?
interesting, isn't it? There's a lot of tricky issues here, aren't there? I mean, I suppose, identity politics, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yes. Um, and yes, I don't have a simple answer to that, because as you say, when people appeal to their lived experience as a starting point, that's incredibly important. That's where all of our values and our ethics and our politics should start from. Real experience rather than abstract ideologies or whatever. But you can't just stop with lived experience, can you? That's the problem. Once you start to try to articulate that lived experience, then you necessarily, I think, you are, unless you put up sort of arbitrary barriers, you're drawn into trying to articulate that lived experience in a way that will make sense to other people.
Right.
Um, um, I suppose issues in a whole range of issues in the area of sexuality start out from lived experience, and too often people have failed to try to understand the lived experience of gay people or trans people or whatever. So it's crucially important to do that. But then the question is, where do you go from there
Right.
in drawing your conclusions from it? And to go to advance, you then have to, I would have thought, look at what we share and look at how people ought to respond to other people's lived experience and what that lived experience is demanding from other people who don't have that experience. I think also, actually, I mean, just this does link up with something we were talking about earlier, the importance of literature for humanists, because of course, literature is a fundamental way in which we can get inside the lived experience of people different from ourselves. That's the great value of the novel, poetry, and so on, that it makes real to us experiences that we may not have had directly. So, a novel about, let's say, the experience of being an asylum seeker or an economic migrant or whatever. It's not something that I've experienced at first hand,
Right.
but by reading novels written from that perspective, I can come to understand what it would be like. And an important fact, the important thing is, isn't it, that that is possible. We can come to understand other people's lived experience when it's made real for us, because it's articulated in terms that draw on our common humanity. So that we can see, yes, if you're an immigrant arriving in a strange country, yes, it would be, all these things would be humiliating. These things would be debasing. These things would be confusing, and it must be terrible to be faced with that kind of thing. We can come to understand other people's lived experience when it's articulated. Sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent
No,
there,
no,
but
not at
this
all.
was on the issue of post-truth, isn't it? You were making the very important point that even if philosophically that kind of relativistic postmodernism is less in vogue now, there are analogues of it in important attitudes that people still have, which need to be taken seriously. But
Well, that's
Yeah.
when you're talking about the ability to empathize and understand other people's lived
Mm.
experiences, I absolutely agree with that. There are within that certain like sects of the activist left are
Hmm.
people who say that um, I was reading this article recently in the New York Times about like the end of empathy, where they're saying like,
Ah, right.
hey,
Mm.
how can you like you're telling me that, oh, you understand what it's like to be a single black mother from reading
Hmm.
this book, and like absolutely
Hmm.
not. Like it's a
Mm.
whole life
Interesting.
story. But
Yes.
um
Mm.
do, do you see what I'm getting at? I mean, there are people who are, or it feels like they're trying to fracture this sense of empathy.
Yes. 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 I can see what, very much so, and I can see the danger. Yes. I mean, there's a truism, of course, isn't there, that you can't experience other people's experience.
Right.
I mean, and therefore, in one sense, of course, I can never, in one sense, I can never understand what it would be to be a single black mother, because I'm not a single black mother, and it's a very different world from mine. But that doesn't mean to say that it's a totally closed book to me.
Right.
And the more successfully people can help me to understand what it would be like, the better for all of us. So it's the article, the limits to empathy. What was the conclusions that were being drawn in there?
They were basically discussing uh, certain thinkers within like the current literary establishment or in publishing who were
Right.
suggesting that um, like for instance, how could a white writer ever write about a non-white character, let's
Mm-hmm.
say, um,
Mm-hmm.
because hey, you don't have that lived experience. But then you can
Mm-hmm.
extrapolate that and say, hey, well, how can a man
Yeah.
ever include a story about a woman?
Exactly. It's just what I was going to say. Yes, just what I was going to say. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And if you look at the great novelists, I mean, often, you know, they're supreme examples of, I mean, I've referred to Thomas Hardy earlier. Hardy's portrayal of female characters. Well, I mean, I was going to say Hardy's portrayal of female characters is wonderful. Now, of course, someone might come back at me and say, "Well, how do you know?
Yeah,
Because you're
yeah,
not a
yeah,
woman."
right.
Then we're just, we just reach an impasse. But um,
Or Virginia
yeah, yeah.
Woolf's depiction of men is something that I feel is true. I mean, I can
Mhm.
see where like
Mm.
it does not strike me as, oh, this is someone who's describing an alien creature and just doesn't
Mm.
understand,
Exactly. Yes,
you know.
that's right. Yes,
Um,
quite. Yeah.
so
I mean, the logical conclusion of all of this would be nobody can ever understand anybody.
right,
Uh,
yes,
uh, but of course, our whole struggle is a struggle to understand other people, and we do it um, through the arts, through literature, and through everyday conversation. Everyday dialogue is all just talking to people in the street. How are you today? Oh, sorry to hear that you had some problems and so forth. It's all one with that same exercise of coming to understand what it's like for other people, and the truism that we can never be fully successful in that enterprise. Um, um, it's disastrous if that suggests to us that we should never try, because that way lies madness.
yes, absolutely. And I wanted to make sure I asked you before we go.
Mhm.
Are you familiar with it's mostly online, but they call themselves the rationalist community? Has that reached your doorstep at all?
Um, well, tell me what you're referring to, because
Yeah,
yeah,
there's
you go ahead.
there are several fairly prominent authors and bloggers, people like Slate Star Codex, which was one that was featured in the New York Times recently, and in that article they talk about this rationalist community where
Mhm.
these are people who are trying to uh, like one example is looking at how to maximize charitable giving. And instead of, say,
Yes. Okay. Hmm.
going to, in this person's example, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with it, instead of going to a protest, give,
Hmm.
$100 to this group that's providing malaria medicine in Africa, and you'll
Yes.
save,
Sure.
100
Yes.
lives or whatever.
Mm.
Um, and purely applying these sort of rational minded techniques. And the reason
Yes.
I asked you about it is
Mm.
because I was curious your thoughts on the idea of a community that calls itself rationalists.
Yes. Yeah.
It's kind of a lofty name.
Well, yes. I mean, within the humanist tradition, the label rationalist is, very much an honored label. But what's crucial here, I think, is to avoid that false dichotomy between reason and emotion, or reason and feeling, reason and empathy. I mean, they're absolutely intertwined. And any satisfactory human life has to be built on the combination of um, fellow feeling, empathy, recognition of what other people feel and other people's experience, and at the same time, um, um, rational thought about how to put that into practice. So your example of um, applying rational judgments to the question of how most effectively to meet the needs of how to combat the problems of global injustice. Yes, of course, we have to our rationalist approach to how to do that most effectively is absolutely essential. But the question how to do it effectively doesn't even arise unless there is that starting point of responsiveness to the needs of others, and uh, ultimately an empathetic awareness of what it's like for other people who are starving or living in poverty, or um, um, faced with problems of uncontrolled disease or whatever. So the idea of a divide between the rational approach and the empathetic approach
Hmm.
is disastrous, I think.
That's
And I suppose also, thinking about your example then, it would be important if you're thinking about how most effectively to meet the problems of um, um, poverty and disease across the world. If it becomes too much just a matter of rational calculation, then you're in danger, I guess, um, of neglecting or destroying other people's empathetic response. So, um, if someone is moved to, what should we say? Um, if someone is moved to work in a soup kitchen,
right.
trying to help the people in their neighborhood who are in desperate need, to say to them, you do much better to just save up your money and donate it to this and that, this particular, uh, I don't know what the
Charity, yeah.
example would be, donate your money. But of course, what you risk there is killing the impulse that drives them in the first place. Now, it may be right that
Yeah.
running a soup kitchen may not be the best way to do it, but if that's what develops that person's responsiveness and awareness, then that itself is something valuable.
I love that. I haven't heard that counter argument to it
Mm.
before, but because it feels wrong to say to someone, "Hey, why are you at a soup kitchen when you could be,
Yeah. Yes.
giving micro loans to farmers in
Yes.
Uganda?"
Yes.
Like,
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Sure. That's
um,
right. Mm.
we're almost at an hour here, so I don't want to take up any more of your time. The last thing I wanted to ask you is, are you hopeful about the future of humanism given all the problems that we've been talking about?
I'm hopeful, but not naively hopeful. I mean, we face huge problems, and sometimes I despair. Well, no, sometimes I am prone to despair. If I, if I, and this comes back to some of the issues that we started with when you talked about, a post-truth era and so on. We don't live in a post-truth era, but we live in an era when a lot of people live and behave as though it were post-truth. Right. And yes, there are, politically and morally terribly depressing things going on. Exacerbated, we haven't talked about this, but it's one of the things that's lurked behind this conversation, I think, exacerbated by the rise of social media. Yes. And the way, I think that links up with what we were saying about closed communities and so on, and the way in which that promotes a certain kind of irrationality. Huge problems there. Huge problems also at an environmental level, issues of climate change and the kinds of changes that they require in the way of life of all of us and the way in which we conduct our economic affairs. I think it's very easy to despair, but as a humanist, I think you just have to look back at history, look at the terrible challenges that human beings have faced in the past. And it's never been easy, and it's never been simple, straightforward, and there's no simple forward march of humanity, nothing like that. But nevertheless, we can take inspiration from the struggles of human beings in the past who have stuck to humanist values and have done so in the face of terrible and huge challenges and have won through.
I think that's a good note to end it on. Richard, is there anything is there like a website where people can reach you at, a particular book that you think people should check out of yours?
Well, I don't have a website. No, I mean, I have a book called On Humanism, which yes. I'd be very happy for people to read. And I would encourage people to, I mean, in this country, the Humanist UK website is a hugely useful resource. There are one or two things of mine on there as well, but it's a great resource, and in the States, I know there are other equally valuable resources as well. Can I just say in conclusion that I think the conversation we've been having is a very good example of the way in which we all need to share our thoughts, learn from one another, and that's what gives me hope that we don't just live in a post-truth world, but we're grappling for truth together through dialogue and discussion.
There we go. That's what we're hoping for. All right. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you
and
very much.
I agree. I think this was a great conversation. So have a great rest of your day and appreciate your time.
Thank you very much indeed.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care.